Good morning, dear students. In my previous session, we had discussed about learning as a key process of human behavior. We had also discussed about the features of learning. In today's session, we are going to start off with the paradigms of learning. Learning takes place in many ways. There are some methods which are used in the acquisition of simple responses, whereas there are other methods which are used in the acquisition of complex responses. The simplest kind of learning is called conditioning. Two types of conditioning have been identified. The first one is called classical conditioning and the second instrumental conditioning. In addition, we have observational learning, cognitive learning, verbal learning, concept learning, and skill learning. Today, we are going to take up classical conditioning theory. This was the first type of learning to be discovered and studied within the behaviorist tradition. Hence, the name classical. The major theorist in the development of classical conditioning is Ivan Pavlov, a Russian scientist trained in biology and medicine. This type of learning, which was investigated by Ivan P. Pavlov, is learning through association. In simple terms, two stimuli are linked together to produce a learned response in a person or an animal. Pavlov, who was primarily interested in the physiology of digestion, during his studies, he had noticed that dogs on whom he was conducting his experiments started salivating as soon as they saw the empty plate in which food was served. Saliva secretion is a reflexive response to food or something in the mouth. So Pavlov designed an experiment to understand this process in detail, in which the dogs were used once again. Now you can see this entire setup in which the dog has been put inside a chamber and how his mouth has been connected with the help of a tube to a measuring glass. Let us understand this experiment in detail. Pavlov designed this experiment in such a way where the dog was placed in a box and harnessed. The dog was left inside the box for some time. This was repeated a number of times in different ways. In the meantime, a simple surgery was conducted and one end of the tube was put in a measuring glass and the other end was inserted in the jaw of the dog, as you can see from the picture. In the second phase of the experiment, the dog was kept hungry and placed in the harness, as I already told you, with one end of the tube ending in the jaw and the other in the glass jar. A bell was sounded and immediately thereafter, food was served to the dog, which it was allowed to eat. For the next few days, every time the meat powder was presented, it was preceded by the sound of the bell, which means that the bell was rung first and then the meat powder was presented. After a number of such trials, a test trial was introduced in which everything remained the same as the previous trials, except that no food followed the sounding of the bell. What was the result? The dog still salivated to the sound of the bell, expecting presentation of the meat powder, as the sound of the bell had come to be connected with it. Very, very interesting indeed. So this association, which happened between the bell and the food, that resulted in salivation, that is acquisition of a new response, is referred to as conditioning. The learning situation in classical conditioning is that of SS learning, that is stimulus-stimulus learning, in which one stimulus becomes an indicator or a signal for another stimulus, that is food. So here one stimulus signifies the possible occurrence of another stimulus. As you can see from this picture, that before the conditioning took place, the food was an unconditioned stimulus because the dog was not used to it, and salivation was an unconditioned response. Then the bell was sounded, which was a neutral stimulus. The sound of the bell did not produce any kind of salivation, so there was no conditioned response. But during the conditioning, when the pairing of the bell took place with the presentation of the meat powder or the food, the salivation took place initially as an unconditioned response, but after a certain number of trials, or after complete conditioning, you can say, that the bell itself became an indicator for the food and automatically produced salivation, which became the conditioned response. So food was an unconditioned stimulus and salivation was an unconditioned response. Post-conditioning, the salivation occurred in the presence of the sound of the bell. So the bell became the conditioned stimulus and saliva secretion became a conditioned response. You can relate to these other examples from the daily life. You can see here that the baby, on seeing the food, which is an unconditioned stimulus, is happy. That is an unconditioned response. Now, during the conditioning, the mother came in front of the child and then she produced the food. So the baby was again very happy. And after conditioning, the sight of the mother brought a happy reaction on the face of the child. So that is referred to as the signal, or that is the stimulus conditioning, where the mother became a signal, or the she became an indicator that it will be that her appearance will be followed by the presentation of the food. Now we learn about the determinants of classical conditioning. Some of the factors which influence a conditioned response are described below. Number one, time relations between stimuli. The basic experimental arrangements of these procedures are as follows. When CS and US, that is conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, are presented together, it is called simultaneous conditioning. That is, the bell and the meat powder are presented together. In delayed conditioning, the onset of the CS, that is the start of the CS is the bell, precedes or comes before the onset of US, which is the food. So the CS ends and the US is presented. This is called delayed conditioning. In trace conditioning, the onset and the end of the bell, which is the conditioned stimulus, precedes the onset of unconditioned stimulus, which is the food or the meat powder, with some time gap between the two. That means between the bell and the presentation of the food, there is some considerable amount of time gap. In the backward conditioning, you present the food first and then you sound the bell. Points to note. It is now well established that delayed conditioning procedure is the most effective way of acquiring a conditioned response. That means the onset of the bell, which preceded the onset of the meat powder. That means the bell is presented and then immediately the meat powder is given. So that was considered to be the most effective way of acquiring the conditioned response. Simultaneous and trace conditioning procedures, they do lead to the acquisition of conditioned response, but they require a large number of acquisition trials in comparison to the delayed conditioning procedure. It may be noted that in the case of backward conditioning, the acquisition of response is very rare because you are first of all giving the food and then you are sounding the bell. So how can you expect the conditioned response to be immediately acquired? Next, I come to the types of unconditioned stimuli. The types of unconditioned stimuli could be appetitive and aversive. Now let us understand what are these two. Appetitive unconditioned stimulus automatically brings about approach responses. That is somewhere where you derive satisfaction or pleasure, like eating, drinking, caressing, etc. On the other hand, the aversive unconditioned stimulus like noise, bitter taste, electric shock, painful injections are painful, harmful, and elicit avoidance and escape responses. It has been further observed that appetitive classical conditioning is slower and requires more number of acquisition of trials, whereas the aversive classical conditioning is established in 1, 2, or 3 trials depending upon the intensity of the aversive unconditioned stimulus. The third determinant is the intensity of the conditioned stimuli. This influences the course of both appetitive and aversive classical conditioning. More intense conditioned stimuli are more effective in accelerating or increasing the acquisition of conditioned responses. It means the more intense the conditioned stimulus, the fewer are the number of acquisition trials which are required for conditioning. So today we have learned about classical conditioning and its determinants. I'm sure the session must have been interesting for you. And in the next session, we are going to start with the topic of operant conditioning. Thank you.